Sometimes the hardest thing a man can face isn't death, it's living with what he's done. For 15 years, Caleb Stone has hidden in the Dakota mountains, running from a past soaked in blood and regret. When he finds a woman barely alive outside a burned homestead, he thinks he's found just another victim of the brutal frontier. But when she opens her eyes and whispers, "Please, not again," everything changes. She's the sole survivor of a ranch raid. The men who destroyed her life were the same outlaws Caleb once rode with. Now he faces an impossible choice: keep running or stand and fight the demons he helped create. Can a man haunted by violence find redemption through protecting the very person his past helped destroy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dakota mountains in late autumn held a particular kind of silence that Caleb Stone had come to know as well as his own heartbeat. It was the silence of a world preparing for winter's harshness, where every creature understood that survival meant respecting the land's ancient rhythms. He had lived among these peaks for 15 years now, and in that time, the mountains had become both his sanctuary and his prison. His cabin sat in a narrow valley where few men ventured, accessible only by a treacherous path that required intimate knowledge of the terrain. He had chosen this place deliberately, not for its beauty, though the view of snow-capped peaks against endless sky could steal a man's breath, but for its isolation. Here a man could disappear. Here the past couldn't follow, or so he had told himself for 15 long years. Caleb stood at his cabin door in the grey light before dawn, a tin cup of coffee warming his weathered hands. At 38, he looked older, his face lined by wind and sun and the weight of memories he couldn't escape. His dark hair, streaked with premature grey, hung past his collar. A thick beard covered much of his face, though it couldn't hide the hardness in his eyes that had seen too much and learned too late that some things cannot be unseen. He wore simple clothes, homespun trousers, a wool shirt patched in several places, and a leather vest he had made himself from deer hide. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, scarred from 100 small injuries that came with living alone in the wilderness. These were not the hands of a gentleman, but they were no longer the hands of the man he had once been. The leather journal sat on the rough-hewn table inside, its pages filled with 15 years of thoughts he had never spoken aloud. He wrote in it most mornings, a discipline he had adopted early in his exile. The journal had become his confessor, the only witness to his attempts at redemption. In its pages were sketches of the mountains, observations about the changing seasons, and prayers he had never been taught to pray. Some entries were simple. Saw an eagle today. Remembered there is still beauty in the world. Others cut deeper. Woke again with their faces in my mind. The mother, the children. I cannot make it right. I can only keep breathing. His daily routine had become a kind of meditation. Rise before dawn. Make coffee from beans he traded for at the settlement 40 miles south. Check his traps. Hunt when necessary. Tend to the small garden that barely produced enough to supplement his diet of game and what little he could preserve for winter. Chop wood, repair whatever needed repairing. Read from the single book he owned, a Bible he had found abandoned in a burned church years ago, its pages water-stained but still legible. The isolation had been deliberate, necessary. He had learned to find a strange peace in the absence of human voices. The mountains spoke in their own language, the whisper of wind through pine, the crack of ice in spring thaw, the distant cry of wolves that reminded him he was not the only predator seeking solitude. But peace was not the same as forgiveness. That distinction had become painfully clear over the years. Caleb finished his coffee and set about his morning tasks. Winter was coming early this year. He could feel it in the bite of the wind, see it in the behavior of the animals. The deer were moving to lower elevations. The birds had already begun their migration south. He needed to make a supply run soon, stock up on the few things he couldn't make or trap himself: salt, coffee, ammunition for his rifle. The rifle leaned against the wall near the door. a Henry repeater he had owned since before everything went wrong. It was well maintained, oiled and cleaned regularly, though he rarely needed to use it for anything more than hunting. Sometimes he looked at that rifle and remembered what those hands had done with similar weapons. Those memories never stayed buried for long. Inside the cabin, everything had its place. The single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, blackened from years of use. His bed was a simple frame with a corn husk mattress, covered with blankets and a bearskin he had cured himself. Shelves held his meager possessions, cooking implements, trapping supplies, a few tools, the journal, the Bible. On the highest shelf, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden behind other items, was a small wooden box. Caleb rarely took it down, but he knew its contents by heart. Inside were the remnants of his former life, a tin star badge from when he had been a deputy, back when he still believed in justice and law. A daguerreotype of his family, all dead now from cholera that had swept through their town 20 years ago. And beneath those, a wanted poster bearing his own face, younger and harder, with his name printed below. Caleb Stone, wanted for armed robbery and murder. $500 reward. He had been 23 when that poster was printed. 23 and consumed by a rage so profound it had burned away everything good in him. His wife, his 2 young daughters, his parents, all taken by disease in the span of 3 weeks. He had been a deputy then, sworn to protect people, but he couldn't protect the ones who mattered most. The grief had twisted into something darker. He had started drinking, stopped caring about the badge he wore. When Jake Garrison rode into town with his gang, offering easy money and the freedom to take what you wanted from a world that took everything from you, Caleb had barely hesitated. 5 years with the Garrison gang, 5 years of robbery, violence, and a kind of numbness that felt better than the pain. They had terrorized 3 territories, hitting banks, stages, and isolated homesteads. Caleb had been good at it, too good. His skills as a lawman made him valuable as an outlaw. He knew how posses thought, how to cover tracks, where law enforcement was weak. But there had been one raid, one night, that changed everything. Caleb pushed the memory away as he always did, focusing instead on the present. He gathered his trapping gear and headed out into the morning. The path from his cabin wound through dense pine forest, following a creek that ran clear and cold even in the driest summers. He checked his trap line methodically, finding 2 rabbits and a beaver. Enough to justify the walk. As he worked, his mind wandered despite his efforts to stay present. The truth was that 15 years of isolation had not brought the peace he sought. It had brought safety, safety for others from what he might do, safety for himself from the law, but not peace. Peace required something he didn't know how to find. Forgiveness, redemption, words that felt hollow when he spoke them in his prayers. By midday, he had returned to the cabin and set about preparing the beaver pelt. The work was familiar, almost soothing, scraping, stretching, treating the hide. He could trade pelts at the settlement, though he made the journey rarely. The fewer people who saw his face, the better. That evening, as he prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew, Caleb made his decision. He would head down to the settlement tomorrow, stock up on supplies before the first heavy snow made the journey impossible. It was risky. There was always the chance someone might recognize him, but necessary. He opened his journal and wrote by candlelight, "Going down tomorrow. 15 years and still looking over my shoulder. When does a man stop running from himself?" He didn't write an answer, because he didn't have one. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming snow. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled and others answered. Caleb listened to their song, lonely, wild, and somehow honest in its simplicity. He closed the journal and prepared for sleep, not knowing that tomorrow would begin a journey that would force him to finally answer the question he had been asking for 15 years. Not knowing that the past he had run from was about to collide with the present he had built. Not knowing that redemption, when it came, would look nothing like he imagined. Caleb left his cabin at first light, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. He carried a pack with pelts to trade, his rifle slung across his back, and enough dried meat to last the 2-day journey to the settlement. The trail down from his mountain sanctuary was treacherous, requiring careful attention to every step, every handhold on the steeper sections. By noon, he had descended into the foothills, where the terrain opened up into rolling valleys dotted with scrub pine and prairie grass gone yellow with autumn. He kept to the ridgelines when possible, old habits from his outlaw days making him wary of exposure. Even after 15 years, the instinct to watch for pursuit never left him. The settlement was still a day's walk south, but Caleb planned to make camp in a box canyon he knew, one with good water and shelter from the wind. He followed a game trail through a narrow pass, his mind occupied with calculating what supplies he needed most. Salt, definitely. Coffee, if the price wasn't too dear. Maybe some lamp oil. That was when he saw the smoke. It rose from the valley to the east, a dark column against the pale afternoon sky. Too much smoke for a campfire or even a chimney. Caleb stopped, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. He studied the smoke for a long moment, every nerve in his body telling him to turn away, to mind his own business, to keep walking toward the settlement and whatever came after. But something held him there. Maybe it was the particular quality of that smoke, black and oily, the kind that came from burning buildings. Maybe it was the silence beneath it, the absence of any sound carrying across the valley. Or maybe it was something deeper, a voice he had been trying to ignore for 15 years, finally demanding to be heard. He changed direction, moving toward the smoke. The walk took an hour, and with each step, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. Caleb approached from the high ground, using cover from habit, though he saw no movement below. The source of the smoke resolved itself into a homestead, or what remained of one. The main house was still burning, flames consuming the wood frame. The barn had already collapsed into smoldering ruins. Caleb circled the property carefully, his rifle ready, scanning for any sign of who might have done this. The ground told the story in tracks and spent shells, at least 5 riders, maybe 6. They had come in hard and fast, circled the buildings, and left heading west. The tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old. He found the bodies near the barn, a man, middle-aged, shot multiple times. Near him a teenage boy, perhaps 16. Both had died trying to defend their home, rifles still clutched in their hands. Caleb stood over them, his jaw tight, fighting the wave of nausea that rose in his throat. He had seen scenes like this before. He had helped create scenes like this. He forced himself to search the rest of the property. The burning house was too far gone to enter, but he found another body near the well, an older woman, probably the man's mother. 3 dead, maybe more inside the house where he couldn't reach them. Then he saw her. She was lying in the dirt near the edge of the burned house, partially hidden by a fallen beam. At first, Caleb thought she was dead too. Her dress was torn and filthy, her dark hair tangled with ash and blood. But as he approached, he saw her chest rise with a shallow breath. He knelt beside her, setting his rifle aside. Her face was bruised, cut along one cheek. She was maybe in her early 30s, though suffering had added years to her features. Caleb checked her pulse, weak but steady. No obvious bullet wounds, but she was clearly in shock, her skin cold and clammy. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching her shoulder gently. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, blue-gray, filled with such raw terror that Caleb instinctively pulled back. She stared at him without recognition, without comprehension, her breathing suddenly rapid and panicked. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "Please, not again." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. Not again. How many times had they come for her? What had she endured before collapsing here in the dirt beside her burning home? "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm here to help. You're safe now." But she wasn't hearing him. Her eyes had gone unfocused, lost in whatever horror she was reliving. Caleb looked around desperately, trying to think. She needed water, warmth, medical care he didn't have the supplies to provide. The nearest doctor was in the settlement, a full day's walk, even for a healthy person. He made his decision quickly. First get her stable, then figure out what to do next. Caleb found a well that hadn't been fouled and drew water. He dampened his bandana and carefully cleaned the worst of the dirt and blood from her face. She flinched at his touch but didn't resist. Her eyes remained distant, trapped somewhere he couldn't reach. The barn was gone, but he found an outbuilding, a smokehouse, that was still intact. Inside, away from the sight of the bodies and burning house, he made a space for her on the floor. He gave her water, just sips at first, supporting her head. She drank automatically, still not fully present. As he worked, Caleb studied the scene with the cold, analytical mind he had developed during his years as both lawman and outlaw. The attack had been brutal but not random. The raiders had known what they were doing. Overwhelming force, multiple targets, no survivors intended. They had taken the horses, probably some supplies, but this wasn't about robbery. This was about sending a message, and then he saw it. Carved into the wooden beam near the barn, a mark he recognized instantly. 3 parallel lines slashed diagonally, deep and deliberate. The garrison gang's signature, their way of claiming territory and warning off others. Caleb's blood ran cold. He stood there, staring at that mark, feeling the weight of 15 years collapse into this single moment. Jake Garrison and his boys had done this. The men he had once called brothers had murdered this woman's family and left her to die. He looked back at the woman in the smokehouse. She had curled onto her side, shaking despite the blanket he had covered her with. Shock was setting in harder now. He needed to keep her warm, keep her stable through the night, but his mind was racing. The garrison gang was still operating in this territory. After all these years, they were still out there, still leaving trails of blood and destruction. And this woman, this survivor who had begged him with such desperate fear, was their latest victim. Caleb felt something crack open inside him, something he had kept carefully sealed for 15 years. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was something colder and more purposeful. A reckoning delayed, not denied. He spent the rest of the afternoon making her as comfortable as possible and burying the dead. It was hard work, digging graves in the rocky soil, but it needed doing. He couldn't leave them for the scavengers. When he finished, he said words over each grave, words he barely remembered from his childhood before everything went wrong. Night fell, and he kept watch in the smokehouse doorway. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in her sleep, sometimes whispering names: John, Thomas, Margaret. Her family, Caleb assumed. All gone now. He should leave her at the settlement, he told himself. Let someone else care for her. Someone who hadn't helped create the violence that destroyed her life. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't. Couldn't. This was why he had stayed alive for 15 years. Not to hide, but to be here now when it mattered. To do what he should have done 2 decades ago. Stand between the innocent and the guilty. To finally choose the right side. In her fitful sleep, the woman whispered again, "Please, not again." Caleb looked out at the darkness and made a promise to the night, to her, to himself. "Never again," he said quietly. "I swear it. Never again." 3 days passed in a blur of careful nursing and quiet vigilance. Caleb stayed at the burned homestead, unwilling to move the woman until she was stronger. He transformed the smokehouse into a makeshift shelter, using salvaged materials from the outbuildings to make it more weatherproof. The nights were getting colder, and she needed warmth more than anything. Her fever broke on the 2nd night. Caleb had been keeping watch, changing cool compresses on her forehead, when her eyes opened with something like clarity for the first time. She looked at him with confusion rather than terror, a small improvement but significant. "Where—" Her voice cracked. He held a cup of water to her lips, and she drank gratefully. "You're at what's left of your home," Caleb said gently. "I found you 3 days ago. Do you remember what happened?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away. That was answer enough. Over the next day, she began to speak in fragments. Her name was Sarah Morrison. The homestead had belonged to her husband John and his mother Margaret. They had a son, Thomas, only 6 years old. She didn't ask about them. Somewhere deep inside, she already knew. Caleb told her what he had found, what he had done with the bodies. She listened in silence, tears streaming down her face, but there was a kind of relief in knowing. Not knowing he understood was sometimes worse than the hardest truth. "Who are you?" she asked on the third evening, as Caleb prepared a thin soup from supplies he had found in an untouched root cellar. "Name's Caleb Stone. I was passing through, heading to the settlement. Saw the smoke. Just passing through," she repeated, studying him with sharp eyes despite her weakened state. "You stopped to help a stranger?" "Yes, ma'am. Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Caleb stirred the soup, buying time to find words that were both true and incomplete. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And because I could. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either." He couldn't tell her that he had stopped because guilt had carved out a hollow place inside him where a conscience used to be. Couldn't tell her that saving her felt like the smallest possible payment on a debt he could never fully repay. Sarah accepted his answer with a slight nod, though her eyes suggested she heard what he hadn't said. She was observant, he was learning. Even in her grief and weakness, she noticed things, the careful way he moved, the practiced efficiency with which he had set up their shelter, the rifle that was never far from his hand. "You've done this before," she said, "taking care of people in hard situations." "Some," Caleb allowed. Another truth that hid more than it revealed. He had taken care of wounded gang members after raids. He had tended to injuries that couldn't be treated by a doctor without inviting questions. Different context, same skills. On the fourth day, Sarah was strong enough to sit up without assistance. Caleb had been checking the perimeter, another habit from his old life, when he returned to find her standing in the doorway of the smokehouse, leaning heavily against the frame but on her feet. "You shouldn't be up yet," he said, moving quickly to support her. "I needed to see it," she said, looking toward the ruins of her home. The fire had burned itself out, leaving blackened timbers and ash. I needed it to be real. He understood that too. Sometimes the mind needs proof before the heart can begin to grieve. They stood there together in silence, Caleb ready to catch her if she fell, Sarah staring at the destruction of everything she had known. After a long moment, she spoke again. "Did you see them? The men who did this?" "No, ma'am. They were gone before I arrived, but I saw their tracks. 5 or 6 riders heading west. They took everything," she said quietly. "The horses, the wagon, whatever supplies they could carry." John tried to stop them. "He and Thomas both." Her voice broke. Caleb let the silence hold her grief, not rushing to fill it with empty comfort. What could he say? That he was sorry? That it wasn't fair? She knew all that already. Words wouldn't bring her family back or undo what had been done. "I need to show you something," Sarah said eventually. "In the house. If anything survived, the house is too unstable," Caleb warned. "Whatever it is, it's not worth the risk. It's all I have left." There was something in her voice, not just grief, but determination. Caleb recognized it because he had heard it in his own voice years ago, that need to hold on to anything that connected you to what was lost. "Tell me where it is," he said. "I'll look." She described a metal box kept under the floorboards in the bedroom. "Family documents," she said. And something else, something important that she wouldn't explain. Caleb didn't press her. He waited until full daylight, then carefully approached the burned house. The structure was indeed unstable. The second floor partially collapsed into the first. He moved slowly, testing each step, until he found what remained of the bedroom. The floor was mostly gone, but he could see the charred boards where she had described. It took careful work to excavate the spot without bringing more debris down on himself. The metal box was there, as she had said, a small strong box, its paint blistered by heat but the contents protected. He pulled it free and retreated from the unstable ruin. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were papers, a deed to the property, some letters, a marriage certificate, and beneath those, wrapped in oiled cloth, a small item that she pulled out and held close to her chest without showing him. Later, when she thought he wasn't looking, Caleb saw what it was. A silver locket, tarnished now but still intact. She opened it once, looked inside for a brief moment, then closed it quickly and pressed it against her heart. Photographs, he guessed. The last images of her lost family. She wore it after that, on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her dress where it rested against her skin. a physical weight of grief she chose to carry. "We need to go," Caleb said that evening. "You're strong enough to travel now, and staying here isn't safe." "Safe from what?" Sarah asked. "They already took everything, maybe, but men who do what they did, sometimes they come back. And you need proper medical care, better food, shelter that isn't a smokehouse." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since he found her, something like fear returned to her eyes. Not fear of him exactly, but fear of what came next. "Where would we go?" "Fort Laramie. It's about 150 miles south. There's a doctor there, people who can help you figure out what to do next." 150 miles, she repeated. "On foot? Unless you've got a horse hidden somewhere, yes, ma'am." "On foot." She looked toward the burned house, the fresh graves Caleb had dug, the life that was now ash and memory. Then she looked at him, this stranger who had buried her family and kept her alive. "All right," she said quietly. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow at first light. Travel while it's cool, rest during the heat of the day. Take it slow." Sarah nodded, accepting this new reality with the same quiet strength she had shown since regaining consciousness. Caleb recognized that strength, the kind forged in fire, the kind that doesn't break because it's already been broken and learned how to hold itself together anyway. That night, he kept watch while she slept and allowed himself to wonder what he had started. Getting her to Fort Laramie would take weeks. Weeks of traveling together, of inevitable questions, of the growing risk that she would see past his careful evasions to the truth beneath. But he had made a promise. Never again. And unlike so many promises in his past, this one he intended to keep. They left at dawn, Sarah walking with determination despite her obvious weakness. Caleb had fashioned a walking stick for her from a sturdy branch, and she leaned on it heavily as they made their way south. He set a slow pace, stopping frequently to rest, watching her carefully for signs she was pushing too hard. The first day, they covered less than 5 miles. It was barely progress, but it was something. They made camp in a sheltered hollow with good water and firewood. Caleb prepared a simple meal, while Sarah sat on a fallen log, staring into the growing darkness with eyes that saw things he couldn't. "Tell me about the mountains," she said suddenly. "Where you came from?" It was the first personal question she had asked since they started walking. Caleb considered his answer carefully as he stirred the fire. "Lived up there about 15 years. Good country if you don't mind solitude. 15 years alone?" "Mostly." "That's a long time to be by yourself." He didn't answer, and Sarah didn't press. But he felt her watching him, measuring him against some internal standard he couldn't see. The second day was harder. Sarah's initial determination met the reality of a body still recovering from trauma. By midday, she was trembling with exhaustion, her face pale and drawn. Caleb called for an early stop, despite having covered less than 4 miles. "I'm sorry," she said, as he helped her sit. "I thought I was stronger." "You are strong," Caleb said. "Your body just needs time to remember that." They rested through the afternoon heat. Sarah dozed fitfully while Caleb kept watch and tried not to think about how vulnerable they were out here in the open. 2 people on foot, one of them weak with limited supplies. Easy targets if anyone came looking. That evening, as Caleb gathered firewood near their camp, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Sarah's voice crying. Not the quiet tears he had seen before, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her chest. He approached slowly and found her kneeling near her pack, holding something small in her hands. As he got closer, he saw what it was, a child's wooden horse carved with careful detail. The paint was partially burned away, but the shape was still clear. "I found it this morning," Sarah said through her tears, "before we left. In the ashes. It was Thomas's favorite toy. John made it for his 3rd birthday. Caleb crouched beside her, close but not touching, letting her grief have its space. He carried it everywhere, she continued, her voice breaking. Slept with it every night. Called it Thunder. He had it with him when they... She couldn't finish. Didn't need to. Caleb understood what she was saying. Her son had died clutching his toy, probably terrified, probably calling for his mother who couldn't save him. I couldn't protect him, Sarah whispered. They held me. Made me watch. I couldn't. Don't, Caleb said quietly but firmly. Don't carry that. What happened wasn't your failing. You hear me? It wasn't your failing. She looked at him with eyes full of anguish. Then whose was it? Mine, Caleb thought. Mine and men like me, who made a world where this could happen. But he couldn't say that. Couldn't explain that he bore responsibility for this horror in ways she would never understand. The men who did it, he said instead. That's whose failing it was. Only theirs. Sarah held the wooden horse against her heart, the same way she held the locket. Physical reminders of what had been stolen from her. Caleb left her to her grief and went to build up the fire, giving her privacy while staying close enough to keep watch. Later, when she had cried herself into exhausted silence, she spoke again. You said we're going to Fort Laramie. What happens when we get there? You'll have choices, Caleb said. There's a fort, soldiers, law. People who can help you, and a town growing up around it. You could stay, start over. Or they can help you get back east if you have family there. I don't. John's mother was the last of his family, and mine are all gone. It was just us, just them. And now just her. Caleb fed another stick to the fire and tried to find words that might offer comfort without being dishonest. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you'll find your way. You're stronger than you think. How do you know? She looked at him across the fire, her face shadowed, but her eyes catching the light. You don't know me. I know you're alive when you should be dead. I know you got up and walked today, even though your body was screaming at you to quit. I know you're carrying that toy horse because you're not ready to let go, but you didn't let it stop you from moving forward. That's strength. Mrs. Morrison. She was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, Sarah, just Sarah. Being Mrs. Morrison feels like wearing someone else's clothes now. All right. Sarah. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, and others answered. The sound was lonely and wild, speaking to something Caleb understood in his bones. Can I ask you something? Sarah said eventually. You can ask. Why are you really doing this? Helping me. Most men would have buried the dead and moved on. You don't owe me anything. Caleb looked into the fire, watching the flames consume the wood he had gathered. How could he explain that he owed her everything? That every moment he spent protecting her was a small payment against a debt measured in blood and broken lives? Maybe I need to, he said finally. Maybe helping you is helping myself. It was the closest he had come to honesty since finding her, and Sarah seemed to understand that there were depths he wasn't ready to share. She nodded slowly and pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Then I'm grateful, she said. Whatever your reasons, I'm grateful. That night, Caleb took first watch, sitting with his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the darkness beyond the firelight. Sarah slept with the wooden horse tucked against her chest, and in the morning when they continued their journey, she wrapped it carefully and placed it in her pack alongside the locket, grief traveling with her, but no longer stopping her from moving forward. They walked south toward Fort Laramie, toward whatever future waited there. While behind them in the mountains, the man Caleb used to be watched from the shadows of memory and judged every step. 2 weeks into their journey, they were making better progress. Sarah had regained much of her strength, and their daily distances had increased to 8 or sometimes 10 miles when the terrain cooperated. Fort Laramie was now perhaps a week away, maybe less if they pushed hard. Caleb found himself oddly reluctant to push hard. The thought troubled him as they walked through rolling prairie land dotted with sage and buffalo grass. Once they reached Fort Laramie, his obligation would be fulfilled. Sarah would be safe, surrounded by people and law and civilization. She wouldn't need him anymore. He could disappear back into the mountains, return to his exile, resume the solitary life he had built. Except that life felt hollow now, like something that belonged to a different man. You're quiet today, Sarah observed as they stopped to rest near a creek. Just thinking about the route ahead. We're getting close, aren't we? To the fort. Yes, another week or so. She was quiet for a moment, dipping her hands in the cold water. What will you do? After, head back north. Winter's coming. Need to prepare. Back to the mountains. Back to being alone. It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. That's where I live. For 15 years, Sarah said, echoing their earlier conversation. That's what you said. Why so long in one place? Most mountain men I've heard of move around, trade, visit settlements. I prefer solitude. Or you're hiding from something. The observation was delivered casually, but it landed like a blow. Caleb kept his expression neutral, though his heart had picked up its pace. Why would you think that? Because I've been watching you, Sarah said, meeting his eyes directly. The way you scout ahead every morning. How you position our camps where we can see approaches from multiple directions. The way your hand goes to your rifle when you hear any sound that doesn't belong. You're not just cautious, you're hunted. Or you think you are. She was too perceptive. Caleb should have realized that a woman who had survived what she survived would learn to read people, to see beneath surfaces. Old habits, he said. The frontier makes a man careful. It does, Sarah agreed. But there's careful, and then there's what you are. You move like someone who expects violence. Who knows violence? I've seen my share. I believe that. She stood, brushing water from her hands. I also believe you're a good man, Caleb Stone. Whatever you're running from, whoever you think might be following, I don't think you're what they say you are. You don't know what anyone says about me. No, but I know what I see. I see a man who stopped to help a stranger, who buried my family with respect, who's walked with me for 2 weeks, kept me safe, taught me to survive. Actions tell truth better than words. Caleb wanted to believe her, wanted to think that 15 years of exile could outweigh 5 years of violence. But he knew better. He had helped kill families like hers. The fact that he regretted it now didn't bring anyone back. People can change, Sarah continued, as if reading his thoughts. I have to believe that, or there's no point to any of this. No point to surviving if we're all just locked into being whoever we were at our worst. Before Caleb could respond, he heard it, the distant sound of horses. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace. He was on his feet instantly, his rifle in hand. What is it? Sarah whispered, her own rifle coming up. Riders. Maybe half a mile east. He scanned the terrain, calculating. They were exposed here by the creek, visible from several directions. We need to move, now. They gathered their gear quickly and headed west, keeping to lower ground where possible. Caleb led them into a stand of cottonwoods that provided cover and a good view of the surrounding country. They crouched there in silence, watching. The riders appeared 10 minutes later, 4 men on horseback, moving slowly, scanning the ground, searching. Even at this distance, Caleb recognized the way they moved, the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. And then he saw him. Jake Garrison, older now but unmistakable, leading the group, reading tracks, hunting for him. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. After 15 years, there was Jake, the man who had been like a brother once, before Caleb had left the gang and become a traitor in their eyes. The man whose gang had destroyed Sarah's life as part of their search. Sarah touched his arm, feeling the tension in him. You know them, she breathed. It wasn't a question. She had seen the recognition in his face. Yes, Caleb admitted, his voice barely audible. I know them. Are they the ones? Yes. He felt Sarah go rigid beside him. She was looking at the riders now with new understanding, seeing the men who had murdered her family. Her hand moved to her rifle, and Caleb saw the rage building in her eyes. Don't, he said quietly but firmly. 4 against 2, open ground. We'd be dead before we got off 10 shots. I don't care, she said, and he heard the truth in it. In that moment, revenge mattered more than survival. I care, Caleb said. Sarah, look at me. She tore her eyes from the riders and met his gaze. I promised to keep you safe. I intend to keep that promise. Which means we stay hidden, we stay quiet, and we let them pass. They killed my family, I know. And I swear to you, they'll answer for it. But not today. Not like this. The struggle played across her face. Rage against reason, grief against survival. Finally, she nodded. Though her jaw remained clenched tight, they watched in silence as the riders moved through the area, searching but not finding. Jake stopped once, studying something on the ground. Old tracks, maybe, from days ago. He said something to the others that Caleb couldn't hear, then pointed south, toward Fort Laramie. The riders moved on, following the southern trail. Caleb and Sarah waited a full hour after they disappeared from sight before moving again. When they did, Caleb led them west, away from the direct route to Fort Laramie. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. "Long way around?" "They're watching the main trails now. We'll have to circle wide, add maybe 3 days to the journey." 3 more days, Sarah said, but she didn't argue. She had seen the men who haunted her nightmares, and she understood now that Caleb's caution wasn't paranoia. It was necessity. That night, they made camp in a hidden hollow with no fire. They ate cold food and spoke in whispers. Sarah sat with her back against a rock, the rifle across her lap, staring into the darkness. "You knew them," she said finally. "Not just recognized them, you knew them. How?" Caleb had known this question was coming. He had been dreading it since the moment Jake had appeared on the horizon. He could lie, deflect, avoid, or he could give her a piece of the truth. "I knew them a long time ago," he said carefully, "before I went to the mountains. Before I changed my life. You rode with them, it wasn't a question." Sarah was too smart for his evasions now. "Yes," Caleb said. "I rode with them. And then I left, and they've been hunting me ever since." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sarah worked through what that meant, connecting pieces he had tried to keep separate. "Your homestead," Caleb continued, needing her to understand at least this much. "They destroyed it looking for me. You and your family, you were casualties of a 15-year-old grudge. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover what I owe you, but I am. More than you'll ever know. You left them," Sarah said slowly. "You chose to leave." "Yes, why?" "Because I finally saw what we were." "What I was?" "And I couldn't be that anymore." Sarah absorbed this in silence. Caleb waited for her judgment, for the anger he deserved. But when she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than accusatory. "That's why you helped me. Not just guilt, atonement, maybe, or maybe I just couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. Can both things be true?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I'm still trying to figure that out." They sat together in the darkness, 2 people carrying weight they couldn't put down. Eventually, Sarah spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "I'm glad you left them. Glad you became whoever you are now, instead of staying whoever you were then. Even knowing your family died because of my past. Even knowing that," Sarah said. "Because if you hadn't left, you wouldn't have been in those mountains. Wouldn't have found me. And I'd be dead too. So yes, I'm glad you changed, Caleb Stone. I'm glad you're the man sitting here now." Caleb had no words for that. No response adequate to the grace she was offering him. So he simply nodded and kept watch through the night while Sarah slept, guarding her against the consequences of choices he had made 20 years ago. Tomorrow they would start the long way around. 3 extra days of careful travel, avoiding the men who hunted him, and the truth that would eventually catch up to them both. But tonight, she knew part of his story, and hadn't turned away. It wasn't forgiveness, he didn't deserve that, but it was something that felt almost like hope. They had been traveling the long route for 2 days, moving through rougher country that kept them away from established trails. When they encountered the marshal, it was late afternoon, and Caleb had just led them down into a shallow canyon when he spotted the rider approaching from the south. A single man on a sturdy bay horse, wearing the unmistakable star of a U.S. Marshal. Too late to hide. The marshal had already seen them. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, then stopped. Running would only confirm guilt. Better to play this calm, see what the marshal wanted. "Afternoon," the marshal called out as he approached. He was in his 50s, gray-haired and weathered, with eyes that missed nothing. "Name's Tobias Warren, U.S. Marshal out of Cheyenne." "Mind if I water my horse?" "Not at all," Caleb said, keeping his voice neutral. "Creek's just there." Marshal Warren dismounted and led his horse to the water. As he did, his eyes swept over Caleb and Sarah, taking in details, their worn clothes, the way Caleb positioned himself slightly between the marshal and Sarah, the rifle that was never far from Caleb's hand. "You folks heading to Fort Laramie?" Warren asked conversationally. "We are," Sarah answered before Caleb could speak. "I'm Sarah Morrison. My homestead was raided 2 weeks ago. Mr. Stone has been kind enough to escort me to safety. My condolences on your loss, ma'am." Warren's sympathy seemed genuine. Then his gaze shifted back to Caleb, and something changed in his expression. Recognition followed by calculation. "Mr. Stone, is it? Mind if I ask your first name?" Caleb felt ice form in his chest. He could lie, but something in the marshal's eyes said he already knew the answer. "Caleb." Warren's hand moved to rest on the pistol at his hip. Not drawing, but ready. "Caleb Stone. Been a long time since I've seen that face, but I don't forget wanted men." "Marshal," Caleb began, but Warren cut him off. "Caleb Stone, former deputy turned outlaw. Member of the Garrison Gang, wanted for robbery, assault, and complicity in at least 3 murders across Wyoming, Montana, and Dakota territories." The marshal's voice was calm, but carried the weight of law behind it. "Last poster I saw offered $500. That's still current?" Sarah's gasp was audible. Caleb felt her stare boring into him, felt the world he had carefully constructed begin to collapse. "I left the gang 15 years ago," Caleb said, keeping his voice level. "Walked away and never looked back." "Walking away doesn't erase what was done," Warren said. "You know that. I do know that. Every day for 15 years I've known that. Then you won't mind coming with me. There's a judge in Cheyenne who'll want to hear your story." "Marshal Warren," Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion Caleb couldn't quite read. "Did you hear what I said? He saved my life. The men who killed my family, they were looking for him. They destroyed everything I had because they thought I knew where he was. I heard you, ma'am, and I'm sorry for that. But it doesn't change what he did. What did he do?" Sarah asked. "Specifically. What crimes?" Warren looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, this isn't—" "Tell me," Sarah insisted. "If you're going to arrest the man who kept me alive for 2 weeks, who buried my family, who's been nothing but decent to me, I want to know exactly what he's accused of." The marshal sighed. "The Garrison Gang hit 6 banks, 4 stages, and at least a dozen homesteads across 3 territories between 1863 and 1868. Caleb Stone was identified as a member during the last 3 years of those operations. He was present at the Thornton Homestead raid in Montana, family of 4, all killed. He was present at the Silver Creek bank robbery, where a teller was shot. He participated in the ambush of an army payroll wagon, where 2 soldiers died. Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Caleb didn't deny them. Couldn't deny them. They were all true. "Were you there?" Sarah asked Caleb, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they killed families?" "When they murdered people." Caleb met her eyes, saw the betrayal dawning in them, and gave her the only thing he had left, the truth. "Yes," he said. "I was there. I didn't pull every trigger, but I was there. I helped plan the raids. I stood guard while others went inside. I'm guilty of everything he said and more. Then why did you help me?" Her voice broke. "Why save me if you're one of them?" "Because I'm not one of them anymore. Haven't been for 15 years. Because I spent a decade and a half trying to figure out how to live with what I did. And when I found you dying, I knew that was my chance. One chance to do something right instead of wrong. A chance at redemption," Sarah said bitterly. "I was your redemption." "No," Caleb said firmly. "You were a person who needed help. You still are. That's what matters." Marshal Warren cleared his throat. "This is all very touching, but the law is clear." "Stone, I'm going to have to—" "Marshal," Sarah interrupted, stepping forward. "I'm asking you not to arrest him, not now. Those men who destroyed my home, they're still out there. We saw them 2 days ago, 4 riders heading toward Fort Laramie. They're hunting for him, and if you take him in, they'll come after me to finish what they started. Mom, you'll be under the protection of the fort." "Will I? For how long? A week, a month? Eventually I'll leave and they'll find me. Or they'll just kill whoever they think might know where he is. You read the list of what they've done. Do you really think they'll stop?" Warren was quiet, clearly torn. Finally he said, "What are you suggesting?" "Let him get me to Fort Laramie. Let him make sure I'm safe. Then," she looked at Caleb, "then he'll turn himself in. Won't you?" It wasn't really a question. Caleb understood what Sarah was doing, buying time, ensuring her safety, and forcing him to face consequences he had run from for too long. I will, he agreed. Get her safe, then face whatever judgment is coming. The marshal studied them both for a long moment. Against my better judgment, he said finally, I'm going to allow this. But understand, Stone, I'm heading to Fort Laramie myself. I'll be waiting there. If you don't show, I'll hunt you down and you'll hang for sure. Are we clear? Clear, Caleb said. And Mrs. Morrison, when we get to the fort, you'll need to make a full statement about what happened to your family. Might help build a case against the Garrison gang. I will, Sarah said. Warren mounted his horse, then paused. Stone, one more thing. That poster said $500. Jake Garrison's current bounty is $1,000. Gang's gotten more active in the last year, more vicious. They've put their own price on your head too, $1,000 to whoever brings you in. Dead or alive. Good to know, Caleb said, though the news sat like lead in his stomach. They're not just hunting you for revenge, Warren continued. Jake's made it personal. Tells everyone who'll listen that you're the one who got away, the traitor who knows all their hideouts. You're a threat to their operation. Then all the more reason to end this, Caleb said. One way or another. The marshal nodded and rode off, leaving Caleb and Sarah standing in the canyon in charged silence. When Warren was out of sight, Sarah finally spoke. You should have told me. I know. Everything you said about changing, about leaving them, was any of it true? All of it was true, Caleb said. I did leave. I did change, but I was afraid if you knew what I'd been, you'd see me as one of them, instead of who I'm trying to be. You should have trusted me with the truth. You're right. I should have. Sarah pulled the tin star from her pack, Caleb's old deputy badge that the marshal's words had reminded her of, the one she had seen wrapped in his belongings when he thought she wasn't looking. You were a lawman first, she said, holding up the tarnished badge. Before you were an outlaw, I was, for 3 years. Lost my family to cholera and lost myself in the grief. Jake Garrison found me when I was drowning, gave me purpose. Wrong purpose, but I was too far gone to see it. What changed? Why did you leave? The Thornton family, Caleb said quietly. The one the marshal mentioned. I stood guard while the others went in. Heard the screams, the gunshots. When they came out, Jake was laughing, proud of himself. And I realized, his voice caught. I realized that was someone's whole world, ended for a few $100 and Jake's reputation. A mother, father, 2 children gone, because of us. Because of me. So you left that night. Took my horse and rode north until I found mountains high enough that I thought I could hide from what I'd done. 15 years of hiding. Until I found you. Sarah was quiet for a long time, turning the badge over in her hands. Finally she said, I should hate you. You have every right to, but I don't. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. I should, but I don't, because the man who helped those raiders isn't the man who saved me. He can't be. I won't believe that, Sarah. No, she said firmly. You get to carry your guilt. That's yours. But you don't get to tell me how to feel. And I feel like the man I've traveled with, the man who taught me to shoot, who listened to my grief, who kept me alive. He's real. More real than any poster or 20-year-old crimes. Caleb had no words for the grace she was offering. Didn't deserve it, couldn't fully accept it. But he recognized it for what it was, a gift he had no right to refuse. We should keep moving, he said finally. Fort's still 3 days away, and then you turn yourself in, and then I face what I've been running from. They gathered their gear and continued south. The revelation hung between them, changing everything and nothing. Sarah walked beside him instead of behind him, and that small choice felt significant in ways Caleb couldn't fully articulate. That night, she handed him back the tin star. This was you, she said. The man you were before everything went wrong. Maybe it can be you again. Caleb looked at the tarnished badge, remembering the young man who had worn it with pride. That man seemed impossibly distant now, separated by years and blood and choices that couldn't be unmade. But Sarah was offering him something precious, the possibility that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing better in the present. He tucked the badge into his pocket and kept watch while she slept, guarding her against the darkness that wore his old friends' faces and his own face in the wanted posters that had finally caught up to him. 3 days of cold silence followed the marshal's revelation. Not the silence of anger exactly, but something more complicated. Sarah processing what she had learned, Caleb giving her space to work through it. They walked together but apart. The easy companionship they had built now weighted with knowledge that couldn't be unknown. On the afternoon of the second day, Sarah finally broke the silence with a question. "Tell me about the Thornton family. The one that made you leave." Caleb had known this question would come, had been dreading it and needing it in equal measure. They were resting in the shade of a rock overhang, the prairie stretching endlessly before them. Caleb stared out at that emptiness and let himself remember what he had spent 15 years trying to forget. It was a homestead in Montana near the Yellowstone River. Small place, like yours. The Garrison gang had hit 3 ranches in the area, and we were making one more sweep before heading north for winter. Jake picked the Thornton place because it was isolated, easy target. "Go on," Sarah said quietly. "I was the lookout. That was usually my job. Stay outside, watch for anyone approaching, signal if there was trouble." The others went in: Jake, Pete Cordell, Martin Hayes, and Johnny Black. All dead now except Jake. What happened inside? They wanted the family's savings. Mr. Thornton refused, tried to fight. They beat him in front of his wife and children, thinking he'd talk. He didn't, so Jake, Caleb's voice caught. Jake shot him. Then the wife, when she screamed. Then the children, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old. Because they were witnesses. Sarah's hand went to the locket at her neck, fingers closing around it. "I heard it all," Caleb continued. The shots, the screaming, the silence after. When they came out, Jake was laughing. Said the old man had died tough. Said it with pride. Like murdering a family was something to be proud of. And I looked at him. This man I'd called brother, this man I'd followed for 3 years, and I didn't recognize him anymore. Or maybe I finally saw him clearly for the first time. So you left. That night. Took my horse and what supplies I could carry. Knew they'd hunt me for it, but I didn't care. I couldn't be that person anymore. Couldn't stand beside men who did those things and call it anything but evil. But you had been that person, Sarah said. Not accusatory, just stating fact. For 3 years you were? Yes, I was. And I don't have any excuse that makes it right. I was drowning in grief and rage, and Jake gave me somewhere to put it. Told me the world had taken everything from me, so I had a right to take back. It was a lie, but I wanted to believe it. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Your family, the ones you lost to cholera. Tell me about them." The request surprised him. Caleb rarely spoke of his wife and daughters. The pain was too deep, too tangled with everything that came after. But Sarah had earned the right to know. Her name was Emma, he said softly. We married when I was 19, had our first daughter a year later. Hannah, then came Lucy 2 years after that. Emma was, he paused, searching for words. She was good. The kind of good that made you want to be better. Patient kind, always seeing the best in people. How did they die? Cholera outbreak in our town. Started in late summer, spread fast. Emma got it first, then the girls. I watched them fade over 3 weeks, watched them suffer and couldn't do a thing to help. Back then I was a deputy, wore the badge, believed in law and order. But what good was any of that when my family was dying? So when they were gone, I broke, Caleb said simply. Completely broke. Started drinking, stopped caring about the job, stopped caring about anything. When Jake Garrison rode into town 6 months later and offered me a way out, I took it. Walked away from the badge, from the law, from everything Emma had believed in. She wouldn't have wanted that for you. No, she would have been ashamed of what I became. But I was too lost to care. He looked at Sarah. It took 20 years and finding you in the dirt to finally care again. To remember that Emma would have wanted me to help people, not hurt them. Sarah reached across the space between them and took his hand. The gesture surprised them both, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since learning the truth. "I'm not Emma," she said, "and I'm not your redemption. But I am grateful you found your way back to who you were meant to be. Even if it took 20 years, Caleb held her hand carefully, like something precious that might break. "When we get to Fort Laramie," he said, "and I turn myself in, what will you do?" "I don't know yet. The marshal said there's a town growing up around the fort. Maybe I'll stay, try to build something new. Or maybe I'll go back east, find whatever family might still remember me." She paused. "What do you think will happen to you?" "Prison, most likely. Maybe hanging, depending on the judge and what they can prove." "You're not afraid?" "Terrified," Caleb admitted, "but also ready. I've been running for 15 years. Time to stop." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, hands still joined, each carrying their separate griefs and finding something like comfort in the shared weight of it. That evening, as Caleb prepared their camp, he noticed Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What is it?" he asked. "I'm trying to reconcile the two versions of you. The man Jake Garrison knew and the man I know. They don't fit together in my head. Maybe they're not supposed to. Maybe people are more than their worst moments or their best ones. Maybe we're all just trying to choose better than we did before. That's too simple. Maybe. But it's the only answer I've got." Night fell, and they made camp in an abandoned trapper's shelter they found. Barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but enough to keep the wind off. As Sarah spread their bedrolls, she spoke again. "If you'd told me the truth at the beginning, if you'd said who you were when you first found me, I don't think I would have let you help me. I know. I would have been wrong to turn you away, but I would have done it anyway. Hard to trust someone whose past includes the kind of violence that destroyed your life." "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but spending 2 weeks with you, seeing how you've treated me, how you've protected me, that matters more than a wanted poster." "Does that make me foolish?" "It makes you someone who judges people by their actions instead of their history." "That's not foolish. That's grace." Sarah pulled the wedding ring from the chain at her neck, the one Caleb had noticed her wearing alongside the locket. She held it up to the firelight, studying it. "John gave me this 7 years ago," she said. "We had a good life together. Not easy, but good. He was a kind man, a good father. And the gang killed him because they were looking for you." "I know," Caleb said, bracing himself for the anger he deserved. "I should hate you for that. Hate you for being the reason they came. But John," her voice caught, "John would have stopped to help you if he'd found you like you found me. That's who he was. He would have done exactly what you did, because it was the right thing to do." She tucked the ring back beneath her dress, next to the locket and her heart. "So I'm going to choose to believe you've earned the right to make things right. And when we get to Fort Laramie, I'm going to tell the marshal exactly that." Before Caleb could respond, they heard it, the sound of horses in the distance. Multiple horses, moving through the darkness toward their shelter. Caleb was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the door. Sarah joined him, her own rifle ready. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, they saw torches approaching, 4 riders moving with purpose. "They found us," Sarah whispered. Caleb recognized the lead rider's silhouette, even in the darkness. "Jake Garrison, after all these years, finally catching up." "Sarah," Caleb said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, whatever you see or hear, I need you to remember something." "What?" "The man I was rode with them. The man I am stands with you. Those are 2 different people, separated by 15 years, and choices that can't be unmade. Caleb, promise me you'll remember that." The torches were closer now, close enough to hear voices. Jake's voice calling out, "Caleb Stone! I know you're in there. It's been a long time, old friend." Sarah looked at Caleb, fear and determination mixing in her eyes. "What do we do?" Caleb checked his rifle, calculated angles and odds that weren't in their favor. 4 against 2, and one of the 2 was still recovering from trauma. But they had cover, and he had knowledge. Knowledge of how Jake thought, how the gang operated, where they'd be vulnerable. "We make our stand," Caleb said. "Together. And when it's over, one way or another, you're getting to Fort Laramie safe. And you." "I made you a promise," Caleb said. "I intend to keep it." Outside, Jake Garrison's voice rang out again, mocking and hard. "Come on out, Caleb. Let's settle this like the old days. Or do I need to burn you out like we burned that pretty little homestead?" Sarah's grip tightened on her rifle, rage replacing fear. Caleb saw it and understood. She was done running, done being afraid. She was ready to fight. "All right," he called back, his voice carrying the authority of the deputy he had once been. "Let's talk, Jake, like old times. Just you and me." "Oh, I don't think so," Jake laughed. "You left us 15 years ago, made us look weak, made me look weak. Now you're going to pay for that. Both of you." Caleb looked at Sarah and saw his own determination reflected back. They had survived 2 weeks of wilderness, 2 weeks of grief and revelation and learning to trust, despite every reason not to. They would survive this too, they had to. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "Ready?" Outside, Jake Garrison gave the order, and the final confrontation began. Caleb tackled Jake before he could fire, both men going down hard in the dirt. The rifle clattered away, and they grappled in the darkness. 20 years of history, condensed into a desperate struggle for survival. Jake was strong, hardened by 15 years of outlaw life, but Caleb had spent those same years chopping wood, trapping, surviving alone in the mountains. Different kinds of hard, but hard nonetheless. They rolled, trading blows, each seeking advantage. Jake got his knife out, slashing wild. Caleb felt the blade slice across his arm, but ignored the pain, focusing on getting control of Jake's wrist. Behind them, the firefight continued. Marshal Warren's rifle cracked from the high ground. Sarah fired from the shelter, keeping the other gang members pinned down. The third rider made a run for his horse and took a bullet from Warren for his trouble, going down in a heap. "Should have stayed gone," Jake snarled, trying to drive the knife toward Caleb's throat. "Should have stayed in your mountain." "Probably," Caleb grunted, blocking the strike. "But I didn't." He managed to twist Jake's wrist, forcing him to drop the knife. They separated, both scrambling to their feet, circling. Jake's hand went to his pistol, but Caleb was faster. He had his own pistol out and leveled before Jake could clear leather. "Don't," Caleb said. Jake froze, hand still on his gun, eyes calculating odds. "You won't shoot me. That's why you left. Couldn't stomach the killing anymore." "You're right," Caleb said. "I can't, but I will if you make me. If it's between you and her, I'll put a bullet in you without hesitation. Her." Jake laughed bitterly. "You're doing all this for some woman you found in the dirt? That's what 15 years of running got you? Playing nursemaid to a widow? It got me a chance to be something other than what I was. What you still are." "I'm free," Jake said. "I take what I want, go where I please, answer to nobody." "You call that being something less?" "I call it being alone. Being hunted. Being one step ahead of the rope until the day it catches you." Caleb kept the pistol steady. "That's not freedom, Jake. That's just running until you can't run anymore." The last gang member, the one who'd been thrown from his horse, made a desperate break for the darkness. Sarah's rifle cracked and he went down, clutching his leg. Marshal Warren was moving down from his position now, rifle trained on the downed men. "It's over, Jake," Caleb said. "Your men are down. The marshal's here. Best thing you can do is surrender." "Surrender?" Jake's face twisted with rage. "You think I'm going to hang because you got religion? Found yourself a conscience in the mountains? I think you're going to hang because of what we did. What I helped you do, and I'm going to hang right alongside you if that's what justice demands." "At least you admit it," Jake said. "At least you're not pretending you're innocent." "I'm not innocent. Never claimed to be, but I'm trying to be better than I was. That's all any man can do." Jake's hand twitched toward his pistol. Caleb saw it coming, saw the decision being made, and knew what Jake had chosen. Death over surrender. Violence over redemption. The same choice he'd been making for 20 years. "Don't!" Caleb said one more time. Jake drew. Caleb fired. The shot took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Jake's own shot went wild, disappearing into the night. He staggered, clutching his shoulder, the pistol falling from his hand. "I could have killed you," Caleb said, lowering his weapon. "Could have put that bullet in your heart. But I'm done killing, Jake, even you." Jake fell to his knees, blood seeping between his fingers. He looked up at Caleb with something that might have been respect or might have been hatred, hard to tell in the darkness. "You always were soft," Jake said through gritted teeth. "Even back then. Always had to talk yourself into it, had to be drunk or angry or both. I knew you'd leave eventually. Just didn't know it would take you 3 years. "I wish it had been sooner," Caleb said. "Wish I'd never joined you in the first place." "But you did." Jake coughed, blood flecking his lips. "You rode with us, Caleb. helped with the planning, stood watch while we worked. You're just as guilty as me and you know it. I do know it. That's why I'm turning myself in. Marshal Warren arrived then, his rifle trained on Jake. Jake Garrison, you're under arrest for robbery, murder, and about a dozen other charges. Your boys too, the ones still breathing. Jake laughed, a wet, painful sound. Took you long enough, Marshal. Been waiting 15 years for this party. Should have quit while you were ahead, Warren said. He gestured to Caleb. Step back, Stone. Let me secure him. Caleb moved away, his arm bleeding from Jake's knife wound, his heart hammering with adrenaline, and something that felt almost like relief. It was done. After 15 years of running, of hiding, of wondering when the past would catch up, it was finally done. Sarah emerged from the shelter, her rifle still ready, her eyes scanning for threats. When she saw Caleb standing alive, she ran to him. You're hurt, she said, seeing the blood on his arm. It's not deep. I'm all right. She looked past him to where Jake knelt in the dirt, hands being tied by the marshal. Is that him? The one who... Yes, that's Jake Garrison. Sarah stared at the man who had destroyed her life, the man who had once been Caleb's brother in crime. Her hand went to the locket at her neck, then to the wooden horse tucked in her belt. I should hate him, she said quietly. Should want him dead. But mostly I just feel empty. Like revenge wouldn't bring them back anyway. It wouldn't, Caleb agreed. Nothing will, but justice might help. Knowing he'll answer for what he did. Marshal Warren approached them, his expression grim. Stone, I need to place you under arrest now. You know that, right? I know, Caleb said. He held out his hands for the restraints. I'm ready. Wait, Sarah said. She turned to Warren. He saved my life. Fought beside me. Chose to stop Jake instead of running. Doesn't that count for something? It does, ma'am, and I'll testify to it. But the law is the law. He's wanted for crimes committed 20 years ago. There has to be a reckoning. Sarah looked at Caleb, tears in her eyes. This isn't fair. It's exactly fair, Caleb said gently. I earned this, Sarah. Time to face it. The marshal secured Caleb's hands with rope, not roughly but firmly. We'll head to Fort Laramie at first light. Get that arm looked at, get everyone patched up. Then we'll sort out the legal mess. As Warren led Caleb back toward the shelter, Jake called out from where he sat, bleeding in the dirt. Hey, Caleb, was it worth it? 15 years of hiding for one woman who'll forget about you the minute you swing. Caleb stopped and looked back at his former friend. The man who had never changed, never tried, never wanted anything more than what he already was. Yes, Caleb said simply. It was worth it. And as he said it, looking at Sarah standing in the torchlight with her rifle in her hands and her spine straight with hard-won strength, he realized it was true. Every year of exile, every moment of doubt, every prayer for redemption he'd whispered in the darkness, it had all led to this moment, to choosing her safety over his own, to finally becoming the man Emma would have wanted him to be. Whatever came next, trial, prison, gallows, he would face it knowing he had made the right choice at the end. That was something. That was enough. 3 months later, spring was breaking across the Dakota Territory with tentative warmth and the first green shoots pushing through winter-hardened ground. Caleb stood at the edge of Fort Laramie, breathing free air and trying to believe it was real. The trial had been shorter than expected. Marshal Warren had testified about the shootout, about Caleb's protection of Sarah, about his willingness to surrender. Sarah herself had spoken for 2 hours, detailing not just what Caleb had done for her, but what she believed about the possibility of redemption. The judge, a stern man from Cheyenne who had seen every kind of frontier, Justice, had listened to it all with careful attention. He'd reviewed the old wanted posters, the charges, the evidence. Then he'd made his decision, time served. 15 years of self-imposed exile counted against the crimes committed 20 years ago. Combined with Sarah's testimony and Caleb's cooperation in bringing down Jake Garrison, the judge had ruled that justice would be better served by letting him walk free than by hanging a man who had already spent half his life paying for his mistakes. Jake Garrison hadn't been so fortunate. He was in a cell awaiting transport to territorial prison, looking at 20 years minimum. The two surviving gang members had taken similar sentences. The Garrison Gang, which had terrorized 3 territories for 2 decades, was finished. Caleb had spent the last 3 months in Fort Laramie, technically free, but staying close while the legal matters resolved. He'd worked odd jobs, carpentry, stable work, anything that needed doing. Saved his wages, tried to figure out what came next. He'd seen Sarah during that time, but not often. She had needed space to grieve properly, to begin healing in a place that felt safe. The fort had provided that, a small room, honest work helping the post doctor, and a community of people who didn't care about her past. But today, she had sent word asking him to come to the small plot of land she had purchased just outside the fort's boundaries. When he arrived, he found her standing beside the frame of a cabin in progress, rough lumber laid out. "Walls beginning to take shape. You bought land," Caleb said. "Approaching slowly." "I did." Sarah brushed sawdust from her hands. She looked different, still carrying grief in her eyes, but wearing it like something familiar rather than crushing. "Decided I wasn't going back east. This is home now. Or will be once I finish building it." "Building it yourself?" "Mostly. Some folks from the fort have been helping, but I wanted to do the work myself. Needed to, I think, to prove I could build something instead of just watching things burn." Caleb studied the cabin frame, seeing good solid work. "You're doing well with it. I had a good teacher." She met his eyes. "You taught me a lot in those 2 weeks. How to survive, how to be strong even when you're broken, how to keep moving forward. You already knew all that. I just reminded you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Sarah spoke. "The judge made the right choice. I'm glad you're free. Are you? Even knowing what I was, especially knowing what you were, because it means people can change, can be better. And I need to believe that right now." "What will you do?" Caleb asked. "With this place, I mean. Once it's finished, live in it. Start over. Maybe help other people who need starting over. There's always folks coming through who need a place to rest, heal, figure out what's next." She paused. "What about you? Going back to the mountains?" "I was planning to. That's what I told myself. Get through the trial, get your cabin built, then head north before summer. But those mountains feel like something that belongs to who I was, not who I am. Don't know if I can go back to hiding now that I've stopped." Sarah picked up a hammer, turned it over in her hands. "I could use help finishing this cabin. I'm handy enough, but some of the heavier work, the roof beams, the chimney, that's 2-person work at least. You offering me a job?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'm offering you a chance to build something instead of running from something." Caleb looked at the cabin frame, then at Sarah, then at the land stretching out toward the horizon. It wasn't much, just a small plot with a half-built cabin and a woman who had every reason to turn him away. But it was more than he deserved and exactly what he needed. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "Some carpentry skills, knowledge of the land. Wages from 3 months of work at the fort. That's more than I started with," Sarah said. "After the raid, I had nothing but grief and a wooden horse. Now I have land, a future, and the beginning of something that feels like hope." "Hope," Caleb repeated. "Haven't had much of that in 20 years. "Then maybe it's time you did." She held out the hammer. A simple gesture that felt like something more, an offering, an invitation, a door opening to a future that didn't have to be defined by the past. Caleb took the hammer. "Where do you need me to start?" Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since before her world burned. "Roof beams. They're too heavy for me to lift alone." They worked together through the afternoon, lifting beams, nailing them into place, building something solid and real. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the half-finished cabin, Sarah called for a break. She pulled out 2 items from her pack, the silver locket and the wooden horse, and held them up to catch the fading light. "I'll always carry them," she said. "Always remember John and Thomas and what we had. But I'm learning to carry hope alongside the grief. Learning that honoring them means living, not just surviving." "They'd be proud of you," Caleb said. "Of your strength, your grace, everything you've become." "And Emma would be proud of you," Sarah replied. "Of the man who stopped to help a stranger. Who chose redemption over running? Who's standing here now, ready to build instead of hide? She reached into her pack again and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, Caleb saw his old tin star, the one he'd shown her on the trail, polished until it gleamed. "I cleaned it up," Sarah said. "Thought you might want to keep it, not as a deputy, just as a reminder that you were good once and can be again." Caleb took the badge with trembling hands. The weight of it felt different now, not a burden of failure, but a promise of what he might still become. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. As darkness fell, they sat together on the porch of the half-built cabin, looking out at land that held possibility instead of ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, lonely and wild, but Caleb didn't hear it as a call to isolation anymore. He heard it as a reminder that even the wildest things could choose to come in from the cold. "Tomorrow," Sarah said, "we'll work on the chimney. After that, the windows. After that," she paused, considering. "After that, we'll figure it out as we go." "Sounds like a plan." Caleb agreed. He pulled out the new journal Sarah had given him, blank pages, waiting to be filled with a story that wasn't about running or hiding or paying for the past. A story about building, healing, and learning, that redemption wasn't a destination, but a choice made new each day. On the first page, in careful letters, Caleb wrote Day 1. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky. Below them, the land stretched out full of promise. Between them, silence held not the weight of judgment, but the comfortable quiet of two people who had survived the worst and chosen to believe in better. The past would always be there, the garrison gang, the raids, the families destroyed, Emma and the daughters he'd lost, John and Thomas and Margaret Morrison, all the ghosts that couldn't be laid to rest, only acknowledged and carried forward. But alongside those ghosts walked the man Caleb was becoming, and the woman Sarah had chosen to remain. Bent perhaps, but not broken, changed by fire but not consumed. Together, building something that honored both the dead and the living by refusing to let tragedy have the final word. In the mountains where Caleb had hidden for 15 years, an empty cabin sat waiting for a man who would never return. Here, in the growing settlement around Fort Laramie, a new cabin rose from the earth, built by hands that knew both violence and grace, destruction and creation. The story of what had been was finished. The story of what might be was just beginning, and that, Caleb realized as he sat beside Sarah watching the stars emerge, that was enough. More than enough. That was everything.